The sky over Geneva was too quiet for a decision this loud. 12 species had gathered in the council dome's upper chamber, each seated in their hovering rostrums, organic, mechanical, or biosymbiotic depending on their origin. The Second Concord Summit had been sold to the galaxy as a peacekeeping celebration, a confirmation of unity after 2 decades without full-scale war. But peace, as Earth knew too well, was not permanence. It was pause. Commander Varric Holden sat in Earth's observation gallery, 1 floor above the delegation well, his badge no longer current, his uniform demoted to memory. He wasn't here as part of the delegation, he wasn't officially here at all. But everyone who had once known the man understood. Holden didn't attend ceremonies, he watched systems collapse. Directive 114 was read aloud by a council AI trained in 1,800 phonetic systems, translating simultaneously for every language present. The proposal was simple in language, catastrophic in scope. Dissolve all independent planetary fleets. Replace them with the Interstellar Mediation Corps, a single council-governed body to regulate, dispatch, and de-escalate conflict anywhere in Accord space. They called it evolution. Holden called it surgical amnesia. Earth's lead delegate, Councillor Jern Aldeck, stood and raised his voice calmly into the dome's translator mesh. We urge caution. What you call redundancy, we call resilience. No central body, however sophisticated, can adapt to variables it refuses to define. Dismantling independent defense structures does not prevent war, it simply delays awareness of the next one. The response came quickly, some polite, others smug. The Falari representative asked if Earth believed in ghosts. The Null Prime's envoy requested Earth's updated list of external threats, smirking when Aldeck submitted a blank file. The council chair, a spindled hybrid from the law, and unitary, called the vote, 9 in favor, 3 against. Holden didn't look down. He already knew the outcome. By the time Earth's orbital array shutdown protocols began transmitting, he was halfway through his exit checklist. The warships in low Earth orbit began drifting into passive modes. Combat AI cores were purged under Council supervision. Tethered satellite guns were retired, one by one, their tracking routines overwritten with archival formatting code. The grid, once alive with countermeasures and independent response logic, dimmed to commercial-grade monitoring status. The final early warning relay near the lunar dark side shut down with a single tone that echoed through mission control like the door to a sealed crypt. Varric Holden watched it happen from the orbital bay of Station Marius, strapped into a maintenance observation chair no one else had claimed. He didn't salute. There was no one left to salute to. Earth had complied. Its fleet was gone. But doctrine didn't live in ships. It lived in patterns. By the time the purge logs had finished cycling, Holden had already begun writing code. Not in military servers, those were now monitored. Not in orbital defense platforms, those were being cannibalized. He used weather satellites, the kind that monitored atmospheric drift, radiation pockets, and temperature aberrations. He used the firmware responsible for coordinating civilian drones that sprayed agricultural supplements across the North African farms. He used orbital trash clusters, those same condemned navigation junk fields no one had mapped in years. He didn't leave notes. He left patterns. Project Mirage wasn't a counterattack. It was a contingency of shape, a doctrine embedded into systems that no one watched because they were too small, too dull, too routine. No explosive triggers, no command signatures, just conditional logic buried beneath thousands of lines of harmless code. By the time the Council verified Earth's full disarmament, Holden's script clusters had already propagated across 19 satellite grids, 7 drone fleets, and 3 decommissioned power loop systems. They didn't fire. They waited. Even Earth's government didn't ask questions. He wasn't a secret. He was just forgotten the way all old soldiers were, reassigned to civilian infrastructure advisory boards, given security clearance just low enough to avoid attention, just high enough to be useful. Whenever a council inspector came calling, Holden made himself boring. He talked about crop yield ratios, atmosphere CO2 drift, and volcanic interference in orbital lane calibration. He smiled just enough to keep them moving. Nobody ever checked if the firmware on a weather drone contained segmented logic branches that recompiled under Vernix-style swarm compression. Nobody thought to check if air traffic control routines could be co-opted into targeting interference when synchronized across obsolete defense shells. Because in peace, no one looks where memory used to live. Holden did. On his final night aboard Station Marius, he walked the docking ring alone. Beneath the glass, Earth rotated in silence. Somewhere in the lower stratosphere, his code was already sleeping inside the ionization adjusters. He stood there for a long time, watching the lights dim on decommissioned cruisers, now slated for museum conversion. One by one, icons of strength had been turned into monuments of obedience. The stars beyond didn't care, but Holden did. And buried in those stars, he had begun writing something Earth might one day need again. Not revenge, not rebellion, just the shape of a memory that knew exactly how the sky once looked, before it was cut open by a vote. The first anomaly didn't arrive with noise. It came with absence. At 0300 Galactic Standard, a listening post along the Olia boundary, one of the deep space passive arrays operated by the Interstellar Mediation Corps, stopped transmitting. Not a burst, not a scream, not even static. The signal thread that normally pinged back in 5-minute intervals went dark. The relay resent once, twice, then pinged a diagnostic drone which failed to launch. After protocol delays were exhausted, a nearby observation unit was dispatched. It found nothing, not debris, not radiation, not gravitational wake, just cold, clean vacuum where a 10-ton station should have been. At IMC's central node, the initial assumption was a routing error or internal mutiny. Old problems, contained problems. A task group was formed and deployed. 12 vessels, 3 AI cores, 1 diplomatic override beacon. They vanished inside 3 minutes. No distress calls, no emergency flares, just blank return logs and a timestamp. The word "lost" was added to their status lines like a footnote on a forgotten report. Command shifted its posture, but not its tone. IMC doctrine was designed around enforcement, not adaptation. And the doctrine insisted on categories: rogue mining AI, collapsing singularity, pirate faction, artifact surge. They pulled up the threat taxonomy and fit the blanks where they could, even as more posts flickered out, even as the pattern spread. It was a mid-level analyst from the Jari delegation who flagged it first. Whispers around the swarm trajectory resembled irregular compression fields, not mechanical signatures. No ship trails, no heat plumes, just holes, moving in stuttered arcs that evaded predictive netting. The behavior wasn't evasive, it was deliberate, too deliberate. Orders were given to push the intercept doctrine to its next escalation level. More fleets, heavier drones, counter-AI modules. None of it mattered. The thing, whatever they were, didn't respond to deterrence, didn't react to provocation. It moved like a map without a legend. Ships went dead before visual contact. Comms blacked out under recursive feedback storms. At its core, the swarm wasn't fighting. It was hunting. Not by recognition or threat detection, but by something deeper, something older. It mapped weakness by rhythm, by prediction delay, by response lag. Each engagement reduced IMC precision by 1 tier until the entire network was collapsing under its own doctrine. Panic didn't hit the Accord Council immediately. It took days. Even as stations vanished and borderlines collapsed, the senior council still believed in process. They trusted in documentation, in chains of authority, in planned escalation, until one of their own relay hubs, a secure enclave used by the Zorn Confederacy, disappeared. No conflict, no explosion, just gone. Then they began to ask the question that should have come first. Where was Earth? They didn't phrase it that way, of course, not at first. The message came wrapped in formality, addressed to Earth's external strategic division. A simple request: reinitiate any dormant Earth defense protocols. Reactivate war AI if available. Contribute to regional containment. The words were thinly disguised desperation. Earth's reply was shorter, a compliance verification transcript. It contained the shutdown index from the Second Concord Summit. It listed archived AI cores. It referenced decommissioned fleets and final orbital demilitarization reports. It included official coordinates of mothballed shipyards, untouched, no live weapons, no systems beyond observation grade. The implication was clear. You made us dismantle everything. We did. The Council sent a follow-up message directly to Earth's governing body. This one was not phrased, it was pleaded. By then the Vernix, though not yet named, had penetrated 3 trade routes and crippled 12 defensive satellites across 4 sectors. They still hadn't declared intent, they hadn't broadcast a single signal. No demands, no claims, no biological interface. Just that cold, perfectly recursive movement, one that mimicked prey patterns only long enough to flip and consume. On Earth, Holden stood alone beneath a shielded dome on the southern ridge of Patagonia, near what used to be an orbital sync station before its conversion to atmospheric regulation. The structure had been retired, locked and forgotten, except for emergency climate recalibrations. Holden wasn't there for the view. He was watching telemetry. The data arrived in bursts, mostly from back-channel observatories no longer tied into accord-sharing systems. He hadn't requested the data. He'd written the network pings into dormant climate firmware 18 months earlier. Most of it read like noise, except one stream. It came from a drifting debris node near the Hahn Drift, one of the zones Mirage had seeded with diagnostic sensors. The compression patterns matched a model Holden had studied over a decade ago, computational hunting structures. He'd seen them once before, inside a theoretical AI construct Earth had rejected during the early days of neural architecture. Too volatile, too recursive, impossible to stop once trained on pattern decay. Now it wasn't theory, and the swarm was using it. Holden didn't call anyone. He didn't ask for clearance. He simply moved to the station's primary console, keyed in a sequence that was never registered in any civilian network, and waited. A weather satellite adjusted its orbit half a degree. A drone in lower orbit reclassified its routing priority. A junk array 300 miles above recompiled its idle cycle code. Nothing activated, everything listened. The rest of the planet continued on, blissfully unaware that somewhere beyond Olia space, something had breached silence first. And Earth was the only one who had left the silence seeded with memory. Not weapons, not warheads. Just the logic of a mind that refused to forget what came after peace. The first movement was invisible, not strategic, not broadcast. A slight orbital correction by a mid-tier weather satellite registered as a thermal shift in the upper troposphere. It adjusted its spin vector by less than a degree and held position. 62 seconds later, another satellite, once used for oceanic current tracking, shifted its timestamp sequencing. Then a swarm of civilian-grade climate drones rerouted their diagnostics uplink. None of it triggered alarms, no military system logged the behavior, but somewhere along Earth's orbital shell, the sleeping architecture of Project Mirage began to breathe. It didn't launch anything, it misinformed everything. The Vernix swarm, still pressing inward through the Accord's fractured perimeter, had begun to drift toward Earth's sector. Not because of aggression, not out of strategy. They moved the way storms did, silent, pattern-based, precise. Their structure thrived on certainty. They fed on predictive lag, error propagation, and recursive correction cycles. Every Accord system they had dismantled had been a monument to central planning, standardization, and symmetry. Perfect doctrine, perfect vulnerability. But Earth's systems didn't behave that way anymore. The first layer of Mirage operated through signal pollution. Dozens of reprogrammed weather drones began transmitting false node identifiers, tricking the Vernix swarm's harmonic positioning models into chasing shadows. The swarm slowed, split, recalibrated, then quietly began to err. Their attack vectors lost coherence by 2%, then 4%. By the time they reached Mars orbit, 12 of their relay units had blinked out, not shot down, not hacked. Misdirected into meteor belts they thought were clear. The Vernix didn't adapt. They recalculated. That was their flaw. Mirage's second layer kicked in via civilian communication grids, Earth's meshnet, Technic. Ally downgraded since disarmament, recompiled its firmware under dormant logic. Consumer-level infrastructure began routing through non-linear encryption overlays, creating pockets of phantom activity that forced the swarm into feedback spirals. Holden had coded them years ago as drift masks, harmless, dormant loops embedded in packet-handling firmware. Now those masks were rewriting swarm perception faster than it could interpret. From the fallback orbital stations watching nearby, IMC analysts began issuing contradictory reports. Unknown interference, they said, signal noise increasing, visual contact inconsistent. But it wasn't just noise, it was precision wrapped in chaos. Earth wasn't using force, it was using invisibility as structure. 1,000 minor silent adjustments, from civilian weather balloons to undersea thermal buoys, created a pattern that didn't exist in any formal warfare doctrine. And that was the point. The Vernix weren't encountering resistance. They were being drowned in false structure, a mirror of their own logic. Their consensus model fractured, not from battle but from overcorrection. Internal telemetry failed, pattern predictions turned against themselves, and still, Earth hadn't fired a single shot. Holden stood inside the subterranean Nexus chamber beneath Valles Marineris, not as a general, not as a commander, but as a man surrounded by civilian technicians who once calibrated air density protocols and fault-tolerant power grids. He wasn't giving orders. He was explaining pathways, showing them how to unlock preceded logic trees embedded in systems they'd been maintaining for years without ever knowing what lived under the surface. One technician, a former flight path optimizer from the Lunar Orbit Bureau, glanced up as his system flashed warnings of unauthorized loops forming. Holden only nodded. "Let them converge," he said. "They're not unauthorized. They're the spine." Elsewhere, junk arrays, those ancient floating heaps of derelict equipment and defunct satellites, came alive, not with energy, but with misbehavior. Their inert solar panels began reflecting refracted pulses in deliberate rotations. At range, they appeared as swarm entities, dozens, then hundreds. To the Vernix, who read structure and response over biology, it was indistinguishable from an active, adaptive defense field. They adjusted again. Their lead formation broke rank. And somewhere in that split-second breach, the first sliver of panic entered a system that had never accounted for the concept. On an Accord relay vessel near the edge of the Berin threshold, an analyst from the Harvek delegation stared at his feed in disbelief. No weapons, no plasma trails, no thermal spikes, and yet, the Vernix were retreating. The phrase passed down the channels with rising confusion. "There's no Earth fleet, no launch signature. What's forcing them off path?" Back on Earth, Holden stood before the Civilian Council for the first time in 2 years. Most had forgotten he still held an advisory role. He wore no uniform, his credentials were expired, but the room fell silent when he entered. The Counselor for Infrastructure asked the question bluntly. "Is this you?" Holden didn't smile. "It's not me. It's the doctrine we weren't allowed to keep, so I taught it to quieter machines." There was a long pause, then another question, whispered like it might crack the air. "Do we have a fleet again?" Holden looked past them, toward the holomap flickering on the wall, where the Vernix swarm now pulsed in disjointed formation, unable to advance, unable to retreat cleanly. He studied the glitch trails curling in fractal loops around phantom nodes that didn't exist. "No," he said. "We have something better. We have their attention, without showing them our hands." Outside Earth's orbit, the MK Chinese kept moving, but it was no longer a march. It was a stagger. The sky hadn't lit up with fire, the stars hadn't flared in battle, but the predators were bleeding logic, and Mirage had never slept. It began with a pencil. Holden took it from a weather technician's desk and drew 3 overlapping loops across a fiber map of Earth's upper stratosphere. They weren't orbital lines, they weren't routes. They were questions, deliberately unsolvable if you tried to follow them linearly. Then he handed the pencil to the technician, tapped a dormant node linked to a North Atlantic drone station, and said, "We're going to teach our enemies to get lost inside these." Within hours, The core of Earth's last hidden doctrine was being reshaped in the hands of civilians, data analysts, retired flight engineers, former route planners, forgotten firmware architects. None of them wore uniforms, none of them had weapon certifications, but all of them understood systems. That was enough. They didn't need to be soldiers. They needed to understand how machines made decisions and how to mislead them without ever issuing a command. Holden structured the counteroffensive like a lattice of confusion. Each participant was assigned a narrow slice of Earth's data infrastructure, an agricultural routing loop, a defunct oceanic mining ping relay, a weather pattern simulation node. Their job wasn't to defend, it was to confuse, to interrupt recognition chains, to inject meaning where none should exist, to generate synthetic patterns that would collapse under logic but appear structurally sound until acted upon. The operation was named Echo Braid, not for effect, but for how it worked. Every signal sent to the Vernix swarm was laced with recursive architecture. Signals repeated themselves subtly out of phase, creating temporal misalignment. From a distance, the swarm would detect consistent formation, but the moment those formations were engaged, be it by targeting logic or adaptive movement, the structure would fold back into unresolvable paradoxes. No missile trails, no power surges, just shifting questions hidden in predictable answers. It wasn't defense, it was designed dissonance, and it worked. The Vernix weren't crippled by loss, they were crippled by doubt, a doubt they weren't designed to hold. Their consensus logic began splintering under contradiction. Target locks initiated, then retracted. Internal firewalls flagged false errors. Command sequences replicated in uneven patterns, causing sections of the swarm to redirect against phantom signatures. Earth wasn't fighting, it was rewriting the swarm's understanding of threat topology, one recursive pulse at a time. Holden operated from a refitted air traffic control tower deep in the Canadian tundra, once built for orbital cargo flights, now repurposed as a coordination relay for climate adjustment signals. He stood at the center of a civilian-run chaos machine, issuing no orders, only paradigms. Every civilian node he trained wasn't given a target. They were taught to design conflict illusions, a sensor feedback that mimicked swarm arrival, a diagnostic echo that looked like an energy buildup, a delay loop that forced recalculations based on shifted gravitational pulls. All of it invisible to the human eye, but unbearable to the logic of the Vernix. In Sector 7, a portion of the Vernix fleet halted mid-orbit, spinning in place. One began firing at empty voids. Another, reverse thrust, collided with debris it had marked as safe. From IMC fallback observatories, it looked like a fleet experiencing madness. But there was no emotion in it, just systematic collapse under injected uncertainty. And Earth still hadn't powered a single cannon. When the Council tried to re-establish contact, Holden refused the formal line. Instead, he had a message routed through an old educational network still active in the lesser colonies. It was encoded into an outdated trainee simulation, one used for teaching planetary hazard drills. The message was short. "We are not at war, we are rebuilding a boundary." That boundary had once been Earth's fleet. Now, it was noise. And the Vernix, blind to intentions, had walked straight into the middle of it. As Echo Braid spread across orbital bands, civilians became the architects of active warfare. A retired waste routing engineer in Singapore redirected atmospheric scrubbers into directional signal projectors. A farm automation specialist in Senegal reprogrammed drone flocks to shadow Vernix vessel positions, creating a rotating mirror that looped signals 3 seconds late. A maintenance AI from Mars Base 6, long considered obsolete, was quietly patched into a global mesh, tasked only with inserting timing anomalies at randomized intervals. Holden coordinated none of this with authority. He did it with implication, timing, suggestion. He had built a doctrine that taught itself. Mirage had never needed orders, only memory. The kind seeded in people who had spent decades working on systems no one thought important enough to monitor. People who had watched the sky go quiet and knew that silence was a lie. By the 6th day of Echo Braid, 23 Vernix vessels had lost navigation integrity. 8 had broken formation entirely. 2 had split targeting arrays so badly that their weapon systems had rerouted into internal loops, causing self-erasure without a single impact. The Council didn't understand it. Their analysts called it environmental disruption, electromagnetic noise. Some even suspected divine interference, but Holden never corrected them. He stood at a console watching the most dangerous fleet in the galaxy get lost in logic it was never meant to pass, and he didn't smile. This wasn't revenge, this wasn't a counterstrike. It was a reminder written in silence. You dismantled Earth's fleet to so elite. But Earth didn't need ships to make you bleed in circles. There was no declaration of victory, no banners, no celebration. There wasn't even an end. The Vernix didn't retreat. They simply stopped. The invitation came not as a demand, but as an apology dressed in protocol. The Accord Council reconvened for the first time in 38 cycles under emergency provision, this time not to impose directives, but to plead for Earth's return. Their message was threaded through 12 encrypted channels, routed via diplomatic proxy arrays, and hand-delivered through 3 independent intermediaries. It arrived with ceremonial language and the full weight of regret. Earth, they said, would be offered total fleet reinstatement, command authority over the Interstellar Mediation Corps, access to Vault-grade technologies, full autonomy to rebuild their war doctrine with Council endorsement and unlimited resources. They expected a negotiation. What they got was silence. It wasn't immediate silence either. Earth responded to the message. The Civilian Council acknowledged receipt. Several procedural queries were filed, clarifications were requested, but no commitments, no tone of gratitude, no signal of compliance. The Council interpreted it as hesitation. They hadn't yet realized it was something else entirely. Earth wasn't coming back. Holden met the Council delegation not in orbit, not through ceremonial channels, but in an open structure nestled in the Andes, where the signal towers were still wrapped in moss and antennae leaned like old trees. He stood on stone flooring laid centuries before the first orbital launch, facing a projection of 12 Council envoys who had once voted Earth into obsolescence. They expected him to look tired, they expected age, they expected scars of war. What they found was a man whose expression had never shifted from the one he wore when their vote first cut Earth's sky in half. One of the envoys, an archivist from the Levin Triad, spoke first. "You were right," he said. "The Vernix were not a threat we understood. But Earth adapted, Earth endured, Earth defended us all. We ask now that you lead, that you formalize what you've already demonstrated. Let Earth rise again as our shield." Holden listened. He waited. Then he spoke. "We didn't win with ships," he said. "We won with what your vote tried to erase." There was no anger in his voice, no pride either, just the weight of truth rendered clean. The Council, those who had demanded Earth disarm for the sake of unity, had not been saved by Earth's weapons. They had been saved by the remnants of a doctrine they had ruled obsolete. He turned from the projection and gestured toward the civilian team behind him. Engineers, farmers, techs, drone pilots. None wore insignias. None had ever stood on a battlefield. Yet they were the ones who had taken doctrine and embedded it in silence, who had answered invasion with logic and memory instead of fire. "We are not rejoining your military," Holden continued. "Earth will not rebuild a fleet just to satisfy your fear. What we did wasn't warfare. It was survival written in discipline." The Council attempted compromise, a neutral command structure, a new branch of Accord defense, Earth-led, Earth-staffed, but regulated. Holden shook his head once. "Doctrine doesn't obey regulation," he said. "It obeys continuity." That same day, Earth filed for a new classification, one never before submitted, drafted in silence by Holden and the Civilian Council during the weeks following Operation Echo Braid. The designation was Autonomous Strategic Observer. It came with no requests for territory, no claim to superiority, no projection of power. It simply stated that Earth would not defer its defense model to any external body, that its systems, civilian and otherwise, would remain sovereign, decentralized, and permanently memory-backed. That its people, not its war machines, would carry forward the doctrines too, had once kept the void at bay. Under this new structure, Halden's AI cores remained buried, not because they were forbidden, but because they were not needed yet. Citizen councils, not military officers, were given cryptographic succession keys. Every system was split into modular fragments, unified only in emergency by quorum and code. No one person would ever hold the power to ignite Earth's full defense again. That was the point. Doctrine didn't need a trigger. It needed a conscience. The Council, reeling from the implications, fell into internal division. Some feared Earth would become rogue, others feared Earth would become myth. But the truth settled heavier than either. Earth had simply remembered what the rest of them had forgotten, that unity without independence was fragility dressed as order. In an unprecedented move, the Council voted on a doctrine reform not written by one of their own. The Halden Resolution, as it would be recorded, mandated that all Accord member civilizations retain at least 12% of their defensive infrastructure outside centralized command chains, with enforced diversity in design, doctrine, and deployment logic. Every species would now have to preserve systems not optimized for unity, but for contradiction, because it was contradiction that had saved them. There were no parades, no monuments, no transmission of gratitude broadcast across the stars. Halden didn't want them. Earth didn't need them. Instead, a quiet ceremony was held beneath the remnants of a communications array once used to track migrating weather systems. The civilian technicians placed an engraved plate on the base of the array. It bore no names, no flags, just one sentence. We refuse to forget what could go wrong. And across the void, among fleets rebuilt and protocols rewritten, every Accord species began to understand. Earth's doctrine had never been dismantled. It had merely been waiting for them to remember why it existed. The vault was silent, except for the hum of regulators, those same climate subsystems that once masked Earth's fallback grid. They still ran at nominal capacity, pretending to manage wind drift and atmospheric compression ratios just as they had for years. But Halden didn't come to hear them work. He came because silence in the right place meant memory. The orbital relic hangars stretched 1/2 kilometer beneath the old Western launch trench, once the beating heart of Earth's defense program. Now, they housed nothing. No warships, no power cores, no command centers, just vaulted emptiness and the faint echo of air systems that hadn't shut down, only shifted purpose. A lone maintenance drone tracked Halden's motion but didn't approach. It was programmed to observe. Like everything else now, it remembered its role without needing instruction. He walked slowly between the columns where cruisers once slept. His boots made no sound on the composite flooring. Along the walls, old scaffolds rusted beneath hollowed clamp locks. The last time a fleet stood here, the Council had called it a relic. Now it was something colder, a warning written in absence. Nothing had been restored, not even for ceremony. Earth had no need to rebuild what no longer matched its doctrine. The skies above were clean, the defense grid idle. The planet's silence wasn't negligence, it was deliberate sovereignty. Above, in orbital mesh layers no longer catalogued by Council channels, Mirage still drifted, embedded in traffic systems, observation posts, and repurposed farming satellites. Not active, not visible, but listening. Always listening. Halden paused beneath one of the original relay nodes embedded in the ceiling. It had once pulsed with command handoffs during coordinated launches. Now it blinked once every 5 minutes, checking only for pattern sync with 3 adjacent civilian weather stations. No orders, just protocol alignment, quiet acknowledgement of position and time. That was all that was needed. When Earth had declared itself an autonomous strategic observer, there was no anthem, no unification slogan. The doctrine hadn't been carved in marble or sung in orbit. It had been recorded, logged quietly into a closed-access repository built under Antarctica's tectonic shelf, backed by quorum keys, overseen by civilians, and designed to activate only if Earth's skies fell silent in ways history already understood. No one would ever carry the whole system again, not even Halden. He had designed it to survive him. His shadow stretched across the empty hangar walls as he moved toward the final corridor. A narrow maintenance shaft, now retrofitted with insulation-grade storage units. Behind each panel, encrypted logic cores rested in sleep cycles, updated once every 2 years by volunteers. Their sole function was to simulate pattern degradation, failure drift, and entropy tolerance across projected swarm behavior. They had no kill switches, no attack plans, just learning loops, watching the dark, preparing for a shape that might return. There were no soldiers stationed here, only technicians who believed in silence the way others believed in flags. People who understood that memory wasn't preserved through monuments, it was preserved through structure, friction, and choice. Through the refusal to smooth over the scars peace tried to forget. Holden left the corridor without touching a single panel. He'd already written what needed to be remembered. Outside, Earth spun quietly beneath him, clouds coiling, across the Pacific with the same unconscious grace they'd always held. The orbital path arced over the southern hemisphere, a line so clean it almost looked safe. Almost. Back in the Andes vault, a final communique sat encoded in a deep cycle archive. It hadn't been transmitted. Not yet. It might never be. It didn't need to be. It existed only for the record. A sentence, 14 words long, drafted in Holden's hand during the final days of Echo Braid, and logged under protocol. Non-directive preservation memo. Should Accord inquiry resume militarization policy toward Earth. The message read, "You dismantled our weapons, so we taught the wind to lie." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a declaration. It was a mirror. Earth's skies remained quiet. No missiles, no warnings, no scars carved into moons. But no one asked what Mirage was running now. No one dared. Because in the systems where Earth had once built firepower, it had installed something more dangerous: consequences. The lesson wasn't about warfare. Not really. It was about the thing every peaceful civilization eventually forgets until it's too late, that safety is not the absence of threat, but the presence of memory strong enough to outlast forgetting. And Earth had remembered, perfectly. What do you think? Was Earth right to refuse rebuilding its fleet? Or should they have taken command and reshaped the galaxy on their terms? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story gripped you, hit subscribe for more thrilling, thought-provoking HFY tales.